Well, welcome back, everybody. Today we're in Chapter 11, which deals with managing and leading diversity. And today we're going to have just a few slides, and I want to show you a short video clip of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So in my introduction, I give you kind of an idea of what the Civil Rights Act is, how it emerged, but in order to be able to lead diversity, you're going to need to understand the laws, and the primary law when it comes to discrimination is the Civil Rights Act. So let's go ahead and take a look at that today, and then we'll move on tomorrow and Thursday with the rest of diversity. Okay, welcome back, and today we're going to be looking at diversity. Chapter 11 deals with developing leadership diversity, and I'm only going to show a few slides. I have a little film on Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is an important law that if you're going to lead any type of organization, you need to understand. So let's go into some of the basics. First of all, we have the definition of diversity, and that's simply the differences among people in terms of age, gender, race, or other dimensions. So diversity is the melting pot that we have today of all of these, and there are other types of diversity as well. For instance, there are people who have disabilities. That's diversity. There are people with different values today. That's diversity. So diversity has its legal, and it also has its cultural dimensions. Now, workforce diversity is the workforce made up of people with different human qualities or who belong to various cultural groups. Now, if you remember from the beginning, I mentioned there are three really major influences that have changed the way we do business today. It's forced us to rethink business. If you remember, globalization is one of them, and globalization deals with diversity. As we go overseas and we deal with other countries, and sometimes we move our operations over there or a segment of it, we have to deal with global diversity. And these are different cultures and values and so forth. There's also technology. But the third is diversity itself. And because of that, we have to really re-engineer. In other words, we have to rethink, or we have to redo the ways that we deal with people in the workplace. Now, we haven't had to deal with that over the past, maybe 50, 60 years. Only recently, really since the early 90s, have businesses have had to take notice of diversity issues, and that's because of the Civil Rights Act of '91. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 came out under Johnson. He and Kennedy both were not real big champions of equal rights, but they saw the political need, and then after some of the protests that had gone on in Alabama with the black community being hosed down by the fire department and dogs were sicked on them. We saw pictures of that, and it really outraged the world, but specifically the United States. So Kennedy knew he needed to do something about it, and unfortunately he was assassinated before anything formal came out. So one of the earliest things that Johnson did when he took over was to champion the Civil Rights Act of '64. Now, the Civil Rights Act of '64, it said you can't discriminate, but it really didn't have any teeth to it. I mean, there was still segregation, there was still discrimination going on. The separate but equal type of clause where you are the same but really not, we're going to separate you in society and so forth from whites, that was still going on. Now, in 1991, all of that changed with the amended Civil Rights Act, and the amended Civil Rights Act now provides for punitive damages for anyone who's discriminated against. So that really put the teeth into the Civil Rights Act. Now, there are many dimensions to the Civil Rights Act, but the one that we want to concern ourselves with primarily is Title VII, and be familiar with it. Now, Exhibit 11.1 talks about the traditional versus the inclusive models of diversity, and the traditional was just age, race, gender, pay level, disability, and lifestyle. But now take a look at how it's grown. It's more than doubled, where you have all types of diversity and the inclusiveness of it. We're taking on considerations that have not had to be really thought of in the past. So just know that diversity has grown. It's going to continue to grow as people change and as we become more inclusive in the workplace. Terms like diversity and equality and justice and all of that are going to be major, major themes. Now, we're going to take a look here at the video that I've got, and I want you to today to kind of get an appreciation of where we were, what Title VII does, and then from that we'll move in tomorrow to the other elements of diversity.
The Civil Rights Act, signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on July 2, 1964, is a landmark piece of civil rights and U.S. labor law legislation that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Title VII is the section of the Federal Civil Rights Act that prohibits employment discrimination. The primary objective of anti-discrimination legislation, such as Title VII, is to ensure that individuals are given equal opportunity in the workplace. The demographic characteristics that cannot be used for employment decisions are known as protected classifications or protected classes. Nearly all employers are covered by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. This includes federal, state, and local governments, as well as private employers with at least 15 employees. Title VII protects all applicants and all current employees of a covered employer. Title VII outlaws employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, and religion in any aspect of employment, from hiring to firing, and anything in between. These traits are called protected characteristics and are also referred to as protected classes. Discriminatory practices can typically be grouped under one of four categories. First, disparate treatment. Second, disparate impact. Third, harassment. And finally, number 4, retaliation. Let's take a look at what each of these involves. In disparate treatment cases, an individual is treated differently because of the characteristic that defines the protected class. Not hiring a qualified woman simply because she's a female would be obvious and intentional discrimination. This disparate treatment means that the company intentionally discriminated against a person or persons because of the characteristic. An employee who believes that he or she has been the victim of a disparate treatment claim must make a prima facie case or preliminary case using the McDonnell-Douglas test, named after the landmark McDonnell-Douglas Corp. v. Green, 1973 U.S. Supreme Court case. To make a case of disparate treatment using the McDonnell-Douglas test, the plaintiff must show that he or she is a member of the protected class, was qualified for the employment opportunity, was rejected, and the employer made an alternate decision. The burden of proof then shifts to the employer to provide a legitimate, job-related reason for the decision. Discrimination may also take a more subtle and usually unintentional form, known as disparate impact or adverse impact. Disparate impact occurs when a company uses an employment practice that unintentionally discriminates against members of a protected class. Disparate impact refers to policies, practices, rules, or other systems that appear to be neutral but result in a disproportionate impact on protected groups. The 4/5 rule, also known as the 80% rule, is the simplest and most common way of estimating adverse impact. Under the 4/5 rule, a selection rate for a protected class group which is less than 4/5 or 80% of the rate for the group with the highest rate indicates adverse impact. Title VII also prohibits harassment based on protected characteristics, although the term harassment doesn't appear in the law. The type of harassment you're probably most familiar with in the workplace is sexual harassment. However, any unwanted and unwelcome treatment because of race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, disability, or genetic information are forms of harassment. Title VII also prohibits employers from retaliating against an employee for making a complaint of harassment or discrimination, whether internally, to a government agency, or in a lawsuit, or for participating in an investigation or other proceeding or otherwise opposing harassment or discrimination. Retaliation occurs when an employer takes an adverse action against an employee who's filed a complaint for discrimination. Retaliation can take on many forms, including, but not limited to, the following: denying a promotion to the employee who's otherwise qualified, demoting the employee, suspending the employee for a period of time, writing a negative evaluation of the employee, or threatening the employee if a complaint is not withdrawn. And finally, Title VII also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, which is the federal agency responsible for implementing and enforcing Title VII and other federal laws that prohibit discrimination, such as the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act.
You can see civil rights is something that has been denied a lot of people for a lot of years. And as Christian leaders, we know that we are to love one another. In fact, Jesus said, "By this they'll know that you're my disciples, if you have love one for another." And treating people equally and fairly, that's one way that we can demonstrate that love. Unfortunately, civil rights has had a long, bloody, deadly past, and we have what we have today because of people who have made a stand against discrimination and so forth. Does it still exist? Of course it does. Today we are just as discriminatory as we've always been. We've just moved to different areas and so forth, and there are some biblical and moral issues on which we stand as Christians, which causes us to not be able to be as inclusive as we would be in a perfect world. For instance, as a pastor, I wouldn't let a gay couple join my church. So there are times when you have to be discriminatory, but it shouldn't be based on a person's skin. It shouldn't be based on a person's gender. It shouldn't be based on a person's abilities or so forth as far as disabilities. It should be based on that person's qualifications. And oftentimes we get ourselves in trouble because we forget that. Well, that's all we have for today. Tomorrow we'll come back and we'll take a look at some of the other elements of diversity. Until then, have a good day.